Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Seth, psychologist, and today I'm doing couch commentary. When I do couch commentary, I talk about something that is a current event from a psychological perspective. And today we're talking about Amanda Knox, specifically the new series on Hulu, The Twisted Tale of Amanda Knox. Who is Amanda Knox? Many of you will know. She is the woman who was an American and was convicted of murder in Italy for a murder that took place in Perugia, Italy, Meredith Kircher, November 1st, 2007. Amanda and her then boyfriend, Raffaele Solicito, were both convicted of murder, and later it was overturned, and an individual named Rudy Guede was found guilty of that murder. Amanda Knox served 4 years in prison. 4 years in prison. And later, she was provided with a payment, a sort of settlement. And that settlement was in the amount of about $20,000 for that 4 years of her life that was lost for a murder that she did not commit. Can you imagine 4 years of your life giving that up and getting $20,000 in return? How does a person get over that? Those cases where they are not guilty, how does an individual get over that? So here we're talking about Amanda Knox, right? Served 4 years in prison for a murder that she did not commit. And yet, think for a moment about the individuals that served decades for crimes they did not commit. Maybe they were exonerated later when DNA evidence became available, but spent decades in prison. Think about the resentment. And you know what? A lot of those individuals are people of color. A lot of those individuals faced unbelievable discrimination, and the courts turned against them, and they served time for crimes they didn't commit. How does a person get over that? Well, this is a really interesting example where later, years later, Amanda Knox is serving as an executive producer on this limited series, The Twisted Tale of Amanda Knox. She is regaining a sense of control and telling the story from her perspective. I'm going to share in this video just a few points that I think are valuable to talk about psychologically. One is just the beginning tone. The beginning tone, I think, of the series is really striking in that it's light, it's bouncy, it almost feels sort of fun and airy, breezy. And then very soon it gets into the darkness of that time period, the media frenzy, the incredible scrutiny she was under, the fierce interrogations she faced from law enforcement. In fact, interrogations that were related to rights violations that she suffered and related later to the conviction being overturned. And the show captures, of course, how dark it gets. But what I think is interesting psychologically to note is how it starts. And what I read into that is that this was somebody who really had a fun and light personality, was sort of a spirited personality and looking to have fun and seek adventures in another country as a young college student. And interestingly, it is partly a personality type, I believe, that was part of how the media came down on her so hard. The Italian media seized on this story, and then, of course, the media all around the world. But there were so many examples where her behavior was put under a microscope, and people assumed a level of guilt because of her behavior, which seemed completely bizarre at times. We're talking about doing cartwheels while at the police station. We're talking about very soon after the murder, being caught on camera, photographs of her having very kind of sexualized, seductive, warm, intimate moments with her then boyfriend. A lot of her behaviors that seemed so bizarre at the time were probably reflective of a couple of things. One, a personality type. Like I shared, maybe that kind of buoyant, light, free spirited personality that I think the tone of the show captures in the very first episode. But also, it appears that there was such an incredible double standard that came to gender when we look at this case. The gender, talking about her in the news as Foxy Knoxy. Much media talk about her possibly playing sex games the night of the murder and her somehow being involved in that. There was this suggestion that she was sexually promiscuous, and there appear to be so many assumptions that were made. Assumption is such an important word in this case. Assumptions that were made about her and assuming guilt related to being a woman, related to gender. What comes to mind is a case that I provided a lot of television commentary on in the past, the case of Jodi Arias at a very complete opposite end of the spectrum of these trials, where Jodi Arias is still serving time for the murder of an individual who was her boyfriend at the time. And during that time, there was so much media focus that was attributed to her in a misogynistic way, talking about her, the emotionality, the extreme emotionality that may not have been extended to that individual had she been a man and committed the very same crime. So we do see a lot of gender stereotyping and a lot of misogyny sometimes when we look at some of these cases when the defendant is a female. One of the things that we can take away from this when we think about how we perceive a very highly publicized trial is when we look at the defendant to think again about that word assumption. What assumptions do we make about a person when we see snapshots of a defendant who is in the news and we see perhaps their ethnicity, we see perhaps their gender, we see what little bit we know about their past life, how much money what type of socioeconomic class we understand they were in? What assumptions then do we then make about guilt or innocence? There are assumptions made, and a lot of times we are not even aware of them. But one thing that we can ask ourselves in the court of public opinion when we become familiar with a particular highly publicized trial is, what assumptions have we made? It's always fair to assume that we have made some assumptions. The point then is to figure out, well, what exact assumptions have I probably made? What am I basing this on? Am I basing this perhaps on socioeconomic class, on gender? Am I basing this on a personality type that I'm assuming exists? Assumptions matter when we look at many of these highly publicized trials. Another point that I want to make is about the false incriminating statements at one point that she made and then later recanted. A lot of people, when it comes to false incriminating statements or false confessions, can't for the life of them imagine doing that themselves. One of the things that we have to remember is it's very difficult for us to imagine what it is like in that situation. To imagine after many, many hours of interrogation, when an individual is faced with coercive techniques, when an individual is faced with so many repeated false choices. These are things that can wear a person down. Amanda Knox, for example, was interrogated through the night at one point. She was interrogated for hours. She was also interrogated without an interpreter. She did not have a lawyer present. We have to remember when somebody makes things like incriminating false statements or false confessions, and we look at details like that, we can better understand how something like that can happen. It is very difficult for us to understand the degree of stress, of psychological stress, the intensity of the cognitive load that an individual has in those circumstances when they are under that type of duress. That type of stress is directly related to a lot of times what causes a person to make false confessions or to make false incriminating statements. I want to take a moment and just give an example of a false choice that often is used in interrogation techniques that can cause a person to feel extreme psychological stress and also confusion. And a false choice example would be this: an individual being interrogated, the interrogator saying, "Did you plan this out or did it just happen in a split second?" Now, one time, if somebody were to ask you that question and give you a false choice once, you might be able to have the wherewithal, the psychological resources, and clarity of mind to answer accurately and fairly based on your experience. But imagine if that happens 25 times, 50 times, after a period of 3, 5 hours, you can start to be worn down. So, some of the main psychological reasons for giving false incriminating statements or false confessions are extreme exhaustion and stress. Another reason is just for the purpose of looking for short term relief. Make it stop. Make it stop. The person feels so overwhelmed, they simply don't have the psychological resources to tolerate it any longer. So they seek short term relief and say something just to make it stop for a moment. And another reason has to do with a perceived sense of helplessness. The individual may feel they're already going to charge me. They already know the answer. They're going to see what they want to see anyway. What's the point? They feel a sense of helplessness as if nothing they say matters. These are some of the reasons for making false incriminating statements or false confessions. Now, the last point that I want to make from a psychological perspective is looking at years later a television series like The Twisted Tale of Amanda Knox, the purpose that it serves. Well, there are different angles when we think about the purpose that it serves. Who does this serve? People have different purposes, people have different needs. Think about our need as just the general public when we watch a show like this. Well, there are a lot of things the public may learn. The public may learn as a result of this. It may serve the purpose of them learning, well, gosh, I need a lawyer present when I am interrogated. Especially imagine being in a foreign country. But then let's also take a moment and think about this from the psychological perspective of the family of Meredith Kercher, the woman who was killed on November 1st, 2007. Now, the psychological reasons why Amanda Knox may engage in this behavior, may seek to retell the story and be an executive producer, that's clear, where she regains a sense of control over the narrative and what happened. In fact, this may be empowering for her. She may feel in some way that A, she gets to retell her story in a way that's fair and accurate, but B, she may also feel that she can send a message to other people about how important it is to retell their story later in a fair and accurate way. But then when we talk about how this limited TV series may be experienced by the family of Meredith Kercher, and in fact, in the years since the crime where Meredith Kercher was killed, family members of Meredith Kercher have understandably talked about how these continued movies or documentaries ends up reawakening a pain and that it doesn't serve a purpose for Meredith Kercher's family. That actually what they want is for her to be remembered as somebody who was kind. So this actually can reawaken pain for the members of the family of Meredith Kercher, while on the other hand, it serves a completely different purpose psychologically for Amanda Knox. I think it's really important for people to understand those different psychological perspectives of different people involved. I can share that I wish continued healing for Amanda Knox, who lost 4 years of her life, for Raffaele Sollecito, who was convicted as well unfairly, for the family members of Meredith Kercher, for the soul of Meredith, a life that was cut way, way, way too short.